Welcome to the Happy Lawyer Project. I'm your host, Akoma Moronu, and I created this show to help lawyers find happiness in life with a law degree. Together with my guest, we provide the knowledge, insight, skills, inspiration, and encouragement you need to find your happy. I'm excited to share today's interview with Alison Monahan. She's the creator of The Girl's Guide to Law School, where she provides practical tips to law students and lawyers early in their careers. You can also catch her co-hosting over at the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we chat about Alison's journey in big law and what she believes are the secrets to thriving as a young lawyer. Welcome, Alison Monahan, to the show. I am so happy to have you here today.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I was thrilled when I got your email inviting me.
So I usually love to start the show by having my guests do just a brief description of their journey in the law and how they got to be where they are today.
Well, mine might be one of the more unusual journeys that you've heard about. I decided on a whim one day when I was working as a programmer to go to law school. So I can't say it was really the most well thought out decision in my entire life. I actually have a really strange background. I have an undergraduate degree in sociology. I was pre-med. I decided not to go to med school and instead went to architecture school. So I did a 3-year master's in architecture at Berkeley. Yeah, I know, right?
Wow. That is one of the stranger ones.
Well, it gets weirder. So I did 3 years of architecture school, never practiced, never really intended to practice. I just wanted this sort of educational experience. And then I actually became a programmer. And so I wrote code for 3 years in San Francisco at the basically tail end of the first .com boom, bust, that sort of thing. And after a few years of that, I was just like, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. And so a bunch of friends of mine in the company happened to be having lunch at this taco place. I mean, I still remember it, Polk Street in San Francisco. And everyone at the table made a life-changing decision on the snap that day. And mine was, I'm going to move to New York. And people said, well, what are you going to do in New York? And without even thinking about it, I said, I'm going to go to law school. And, people were like, you can't just do that. There's like a process here. Like, have you taken the LSAT? I was like, no, but I'll just sign up for the next one and take it. And that's basically what I did. I mean, I took the summer LSAT, and then, 6 months later, I find myself like standing in New York City going, oh my God, how did this happen? And from there, I had a more traditional path. Like, I clerked, I worked in big law. And then at some point decided I was doing patent litigation. And I liked the work, actually. I just didn't like the whole culture, the hours, that kind of stuff, working for crazy people. And so at some point I basically decided this is not what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I'd had the idea for writing a book, which was going to be The Girl's Guide to Law School, while I was in law school. And I'd done some research and had sort of started it. But of course, it fell by the wayside, clerking and working in big law. I admire you that you do things on the side. I was not able to do that. And, my friends were basically like, look, we've been hearing about this book for 5 years now. Like, either write the book or stop talking about it. And I thought at some point that was pretty good advice. So after mulling it over for, probably a year, I quit. And I really didn't know exactly what I was going to do. I thought I might start a practice with some friends. I know I wanted to work on the book. The book eventually became the website, which is The Girl's Guide to Law School. I've never finished the book. And on Twitter, actually, randomly, I met my now business partner, Lee. And Lee lived in San Francisco. She had just recently had started working for herself. She was also ex-big law. Same thing, like, not what I want to do with my life. Asked to go part-time. They said no. She quit. And she actually started a bar tutoring service. And so she was working with bar students and law students in the Bay Area at different schools, helping them basically be better law students and pass the bar. And so we actually literally met on Twitter. We had coffee, we hit it off. And the second time that we had ever met, we decided to start a business, which became the Law School Toolbox and the Bar Exam Toolbox.
It's so interesting that you say that, because I recently interviewed Danielle Liss, and she's the founder of #Legal. And her and her partner are also both lawyers, and they met on Twitter. And after their first meeting, decided to launch a business together.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like getting married on a blind date.
Seems like the place to be.
It's one of those things that in retrospect, when you tell people, they kind of look at you like, are you out of your mind? But honestly, like, it's worked out amazingly well. Like, we're great business partners. We're great friends. Like, I can't imagine having a better business partner. I mean, obviously we got super lucky, but I think some of that is also about, being willing to recognize an opportunity when it presents itself and not being so risk averse as a lawyer. They're like, oh no, we need to know each other for a year before we could do anything. It's like, well, try it and see how it goes. This is probably why I was not a very good lawyer.
Oh my God. There's so much in there that I want to ask you about. So first of all, I want to know, why did either of you, I guess you might not know about what her reasoning, but why did you decide to stay working with lawyers if it didn't really feel like the right fit for you?
Oh, well, I mean, I loved law school. Like, I thought law school was great. I actually enjoyed the work of being a lawyer. I guess for me, a large part of why I started the Girls Guide to Law School was essentially it was a resource that I would have wanted to have when I was starting law school. That site particularly really talks about a lot of things that were not necessarily part of the conversation. I mean, everybody puts on this kind of shiny front when they're in law school, like, oh no, everything's great. Everything's great. I'm like, no, I'll talk about being clinically depressed my second semester. Like, here's how that happened. Well, here's what I did about it, And because I wasn't in big law and I didn't want to be back in big law ever, I still don't think, I could talk about things like getting a cold offer, for example, that most people understandably would not be comfortable sort of putting out there on Google when they go for a job interview at their next firm.
Interesting. No, that totally makes sense. And how long were you at Big Law?
I think it was about 3 years.
Okay. I think that's about
average. I was in that zone of like, oh, what am I doing? Basically, I left after I'd been working on this one case sort of almost on my own for a couple of years. And that settled literally on the eve of trial. Like, I think we were supposed to fly to Delaware the next day and the case settled. And so I had actually close to a month because it was like October. I'd already billed all my necessary hours for the entire year. And so I had, a few weeks to basically sit around and not do any work and really think about the life of all the partners that I knew. And my basic question was, would I trade places with any of these people? And when the answer came back no, it was sort of pretty clear what I needed to do.
I want to ask this to you because it's something I think about a lot lately, and I don't know have the answer to it because I'm a transactional attorney. But it seems like most of the lawyers that I've met who've really taken big leaps out of big law have been litigators.
I think that's probably right. I mean,
why do you think that is?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think there are a couple of reasons. One, I think it's probably a personality trait in that if you know or you can predict that you're not going to stay in big law forever, which, frankly, most people probably should predict just based on the numbers, the path that makes the most sense is to be a transactional attorney because then you set yourself up for other opportunities. The problem with being a litigator is there basically are no other opportunities.
Fair enough. So everything looks like a big leap after that.
Well, I just think the person who's playing the odds is not going to be a litigator. It's just a different personality type, I think. And the reality is like you really don't have your options are more limited, I think. I think if you're being smart about it and you know that, okay, I want a career in law, but maybe I don't want to be in a firm forever. I mean, I would definitely say you should probably do transactional work just because, being a litigator, you basically have to retool what it is that you're doing. I mean, of course, you can start your own practice or something, but basically, you don't really have transferable skills.
That makes perfect sense. So let's get back to what you do for law students and young lawyers. What do you think are the conversations that, key conversations that people should be having that they're really not?
Well, I think I always tell people to approach law school with a healthy skepticism. I think a lot of people, right now I'm talking to a lot of 1Ls who've just gotten their grades and they're disappointed with those grades typically, or they wouldn't be calling me. And a lot of them are like, I didn't get the game that's being played. I didn't realize there was a different game going on. I thought I could just show up to school and people would sort of tell me what to do. And I would do that. And then I would, tell them that on the exam and regurgitate it back. And that was what I needed to do well in law school. And it's like, that's not what this is about, And so I think there's I don't know if it's like naivete or what, but people just kind of go into this thinking someone else is going to tell them how to do everything. And like, they just have to execute, which is, I guess, basically what people did as undergrad. It's like, okay, here are the requirements. Here are the hoops that you jump through the hoops, jump a little bit higher than everyone else. You get an A. Congratulations. But I think it's just a different narrative. And I think that plays out in the profession too.
I completely agree. And I think I would even take it further and say that people think that that's going to happen in life. Like, yeah,
exactly.
I think people,
there's just a path.
Correct. And like people will tell you when you're around this age, you start thinking about getting married. Around this age, you start thinking about buying a house. And then when no one tells them, they just do what everyone else is doing because they just are executing plans that are being handed down.
Yeah. And I think, I think with any of these things, like you have to be skeptical about whether this is a good idea for you. You can't just be like, oh, I'm going to buy a house because buying a house is a good investment. It's like, well, what does that mean?
Yeah. Oh, agreed.
Like I remember I bought a place in San Francisco, which is a duplex in the end of 2008 when I was at the firm. And I remember this partner who I worked for, who was a good friend of mine, came in and she's like, congratulations. We love it when associates buy houses. Now you can't quit. And I just kind of looked at her and I'm like, I wouldn't have done this if that was the case. I just bought a 2-bedroom, like a 1-bedroom duplex. The whole idea is I live in half of it and I rent out half of it and that pays the mortgage. And then if I want to leave, I rent out both of them and I make money. And she just kind of of looked at me and was like, oh, yeah, that's a lot smarter than most people.
The number of people I've had that conversation with, like, don't buy a house just because I actually go back a step, just moved from Brooklyn to Dallas, Texas. And
oh, wow.
In Brooklyn, yeah. In Brooklyn, the buy a house conversation with junior associates was not really a conversation.
Right.
But now all of a sudden, summer associates are asking me if they should rent or buy when they become first years. And I'm like, you should definitely rent.
Right. Well, I remember the judge I worked for, that was the piece of advice he gave to all of his clerks. He's like, don't take on a mortgage. He's just like, he's like, go work at a firm. You're all going to do it. It's fine. Get some experience. Maybe you love it. Maybe you don't. He's like, just make sure you can leave when you want to leave.
So for people who are struggling and not understanding why they're not getting the grades they want or kind of getting the success they want in the law, what kind of tips do you offer for them?
Well, interestingly enough, I just spent the last week working intensively on a course that tries to answer this question for law students. But no, I think the reality is you've got to critically evaluate the situation that you're in and figure out how you've ended up in the situation. And if that situation is not what is making you happy, then I think sometimes lawyers get trapped in their own heads. I have a friend who works with, transitioning lawyers who want to get into a different job or out of practice. And she says with almost all of them come to me and they're like, if I'm not a lawyer, I'm going to end up living under a bridge. And she's like, that's just not realistic. But like, I've heard it so many times that like, I just bring it up with people. I'm like, all right, like you're a smart person. You have a lot of skills. You can figure things out. You're not going to be under a bridge. Let's just like put that aside. So I think it's really a question of critically evaluating the situation, figuring out what tools are available to you to build the kind of capacity, whether it's skills or other things you need to make that step into something that gets you closer to what you think you want, and then evaluate how that's going.
I think it's sometimes hard for people to hear this advice because it seems so obvious, yet it doesn't feel like people are doing it.
No, I think there's a certain personality that tends to go to law school a lot of the time. And that personality tends to be a little bit conformist, like overachiever, people pleasing, good student, teacher's pet. And so I think it's really hard to break out of that, especially when everyone's telling you like, oh, if you get this summer associate job, like you're set up for life. And it's like, that's just not true. Like look at the attrition rates in these firms. Look at the number of people in a summer associate class who 8 or 10 years later make partner. Like this is not like you just signed up and won the lottery and your life is golden. Like you have to make a plan. You have to be strategic about what you're getting yourself into.
And I think part of the issue is also a lot of people know that they don't want to be partner. And I for one went into BigLaw kind of with a really strong international public background, like having worked at Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, all of that kind of stuff that felt like I should go to law school next in order to do more of that.
Right.
I have an LLM in international criminal law. Like here I am, 5 years later in BigLaw. So who knows where life will lead you. But for the people that I talk to, the young associates, they feel so lost because they don't know what their options are. And they think that they know they don't want to be partner, but they don't know what else they could want. So they just kind of keep doing the steps until life forces them to make a decision. And I guess, do you have any tips for young lawyers, law students about how to start discovering what your options are when you're in that position?
To be perfectly honest, I would say go to therapy. And that's not really, it's honestly not a flip answer. Like I remember when my second semester, I was clinically depressed, and this has happened a couple of times in the past. I thought, it was a one-off. Finally, I was like, okay, this is not a one-off. I need to deal with it. And so I went and got a therapist at Columbia, and literally it was life-changing. And it sounds crazy when I tell you this, but basically most of what she did was I would be telling some crazy story and she would say, so how does that make you feel? And I'd be like, well, I think blah, blah, blah. And she's like, that's not what I asked you. I asked you how that made you feel. And I was like, I have no idea how to answer that question. And so it was this crazy process where she would sit there and be like, well, do you feel like tension in your stomach or your hands sweating? I'm like, oh yeah. She's like, that's anxiety. I'm like, oh, is that what that feels like? So, I think it's that's a really kind of fundamental thing about tapping into, yourself. I think Martha Beck has a really interesting book on this. Like finding your North Star, that's all about like the bodily sensations. But I think if you are someone who, your whole life has been basically valued for achieving, you actually literally lose touch with yourself, like what you think or you feel about things. And I think recovering that is really the first step, because then if you're getting like a really weird vibe about a situation at work, you can kind of tune into that and be like, why am I reacting like this? Like, what's going on here? It's actually a very valuable skill set, it turns out.
That was so well put. And I recently had a guest on named Lulu Mins, and she was talking about that exact sensation about learning to be more in tune to her gut feeling about things and like knowing what that was, because she had been taught for so long not to pay attention to it and not really let the sweaty palms mean anything.
Right. And, in law school, it's like nobody's asking you, like, how you're feeling about things. It's like, are you getting your work done? Like, you learn to really tamp down all of your emotions. And as a lawyer, you're supposed to be like emotionless. I mean, I think that's terrible advice. I think the best lawyers are actually generally like very empathetic. But I think the message a lot of people get is that you're supposed to suppress any bad feelings you have and just deal with it. And I think that's terrible advice.
And there's definitely been a shift away from that, at least in what I'm seeing at firms and at law schools, like talking to law schools in the last couple of years, is you do see them bringing on more counselors and coaches to talk to the whole person.
Right. Which I think is great.
Yeah.
And they should be doing, increasing every day more of that.
Absolutely. But the second half to that is that the recipients, the lawyers and law students, also need to learn the vocabulary and know that those resources are available and helpful.
Right. And I think, it's easy to be like, oh, well, I don't have time for this, like, hippie bullshit, basically. Right, and it's like, hey, guess what? Actually, emotional intelligence, kind of important when you're dealing with people under a lot of stress, which almost everyone, I guess that's also one difference between litigating and being a transactional person is as a litigator, you're never dealing with people on their best behavior. Like that is just not why you get the phone call.
Oh, that's also interesting. Yeah. Also, in my research on happiness, which is like my favorite topic, hence the podcast, is being more emotionally intelligent and stable is so beneficial to your practice. Like there's
for sure.
So many ways in which it will make you a better lawyer. And that's the number one resistance point I get from people when I talk to them about this stuff is they're going to lose their edge. They're not going to be able to really get the work done, especially litigators. Right.
The client wants them to be like a, lion or whatever. It's like
a bulldog.
Whatever. It's actually the client just wants you to get the best result you can get. And you don't have to be a jerk to do that. I think the legal profession is inherently a pretty high stress profession. And I think if people develop the tools to deal with that on a personal level, it can also really be beneficial in like reading a situation and that kind of thing and can really benefit your practice.
And I always like to tell people that no matter what your thought is or your emotional response to something is, it should be limited by its usefulness. So it may be useful to be an attack dog or to be a shark or whatever, but is it useful to bring that into your personal life? Or to have it cause you so much stress that you're like not sleeping and like binge drinking,
Yeah, it's like you got to take care of yourself. And we have a series on one of my sites that was done by a lawyer turned therapist who's basically like, a multi-part series on the things you learned in law school that you shouldn't do at home. And I think that's right. I think anyone who's trained as a lawyer has definitely had their significant other be like, stop lawyering me.
Yep.
And it's a fair point. These are skills that have a reason and a purpose, and they're useful in context, but you do, I think, have to be careful about how you use them.
So I would love to dive a little bit into the other side of this conversation, which is kind of more about you. And you mentioned to me that you were living in Mexico City now.
I am.
So tell me a little bit about that decision and kind of location independence and what that means for you.
Well, being location independent is totally awesome. I highly recommend it if you can swing it. I'm not going to claim that like I had some grand vision that, when I left my firm job, I was going to be location independent and like living in another country or anything like that. It's just not, that's not the reality. I ended up in Mexico essentially because a friend of a friend had an apartment here last summer that she was looking to rent. And I was like, well, I'm kind of bored with San Francisco. No reason to be there in the summer. It's foggy. Like, why don't I just move to Mexico for a few months? I was, looking for a change. And actually, it really started because one of the people who works for us as a tutor has been living all over the world for the last several years. And I was kind of like, wait, if she can make this work, maybe I can make this work. And so it was really just sort of a test balloon, but I ended up liking it. And so I extended my stay for a few more months. I came back to the US for a few months in the winter, came back here, ended up meeting someone like the end of last year. So it's a kind of classic story. But yeah, basically there's a guy in Mexico City. So no, I mean, but it is this interesting thing of like, well, I really just need the internet. You know, my internet here is faster than my internet in my house in San Francisco. So no one really cares where I am.
I love to travel, and a lot of people bemoan the 24/7 iPhone connection, and perhaps this is why I've survived as long as I have in BigLaw, is in part my optimistic outlook and because I don't mind being a workhorse. So the fact that I may have to bill from the beach in Mexico doesn't bother me because I get to be on the beach in Mexico.
Yeah, I think it's always a balance.
Oh, absolutely. And I definitely feel like there's a maximum, and it's not that high, of hours I'm willing to bill and still call it a vacation. But I think that with technology, it's interesting to see where things will go because we don't want to feel beholden to it and to the job when we're not supposed to be working. But at the same time, it does create more opportunities for people to work more flexibly than they could have, 15, 20 years ago. Because it really is seamless at this point.
Right. No, I think that's a great point. This is a conversation Lee and I have all the time. Like she's currently, taking a social media diet because she's just like, it's too much. And I agree. I mean, I think people sometimes have, I guess people have romantic ideas about everything, but certainly they have romantic ideas about like, oh, you're location independent. Yeah. You must just spend all of your day in a cafe. It's like, I was literally working at midnight on New Year's Eve. Oh. Okay. But I chose to do that, yeah. But that's what I did. So it's not, nothing is a fantasy. Nothing is a fairy tale, basically. Like everything has pros and cons. And I think it's really about, figuring out a balance that works for you.
And there's also something to be said about the word chose to do it. When you feel like you have choices and you're not stuck in your situation, there's something liberating about that. And I think even for a lot of people who are lawyers, especially big law attorneys, they feel like they've been bamboozled or something, and like they're stuck in a situation that's untenable. And the reality is they pick that situation and
they're picking it every day.
Correctly. And they're making, and not just that, but they are also choosing to feel that way about that choice.
I'll give you a brief anecdote. Like when I left BigLaw, I heard some very interesting things from different people, but one of them was a partner who came into my office one night really late, and he shut the door and he's just like, "You've got to tell me how to do it." I'm like, how to do what? He's like, "You've got to tell me how to leave. I've got to get out of here." I'm like, it's pretty simple. You just say you're leaving. He's still there.
Wow.
I find that really sad. I'm like, if you don't want to be doing this, do something else. Like if this is not the right place for you or it's not the right fit, like you have a lot of money. You have a lot of skills. You have a lot of like a huge network. Like you are not stuck here. You can be doing something else.
Honestly, it feels like people are birds in a cage with an open door.
Yeah, exactly. And it is hard. I'm not going to lie. Like,
absolutely.
People have student loans. I have student loans. Like, people have all kinds of stuff. But the reality is, like, you do not have to be doing whatever you're doing if it's really a terrible choice. You're not stuck there.
Life is hard, right? Like, that's a thing. Like, it's not like life is ever going to be kind of sunshine and roses every day, but you get to choose what kind of hard it is. And at the end of the day, being comfortable and doing the things you want are often going to be different choices, right? Like if you want to be super comfortable in life and kind of have the predictability that comes with following a quote unquote path versus doing this big idea or chasing this big dream, that's not going to feel comfortable. And as a lawyer, it's surprising to me because I feel like we get really good at pushing past discomfort, yet we aren't willing to do it for ourselves.
Yeah, and that's actually something that I've always tried to work on sort of consciously. I mean, people ask me like, well, why did you go to architecture school if you didn't want to be an architect? And I'm like, because I thought it would be really hard. And that's a real showstopper. But it's true. It's because, my entire life, like I was good at school, like I did sociology. It wasn't that hard. And I wanted to do something that would like really totally kick my butt because I needed to get over the idea that like I was just going to be good at everything that I tried and that I wasn't going to have to work hard. Like I wanted to work really hard and I wanted to do something I was bad at. I mean, it was a pretty miserable 3 years. I'm not sure I'd recommend that. But, it's kind of like going to the military or something. It's like, that's what boot camp is about, like pushing you beyond what you think you're capable of so that other things seem easier afterwards.
Good for you. I recently realized that I don't fail enough. And I think that led me to realize that I'm not pushing myself hard enough to do hard things. And it's funny that you said you were a programmer, because my husband and I have kind of made a promise to do something, to learn a new skill together that was going to be really hard.
Nice.
Because we thought it would be a really good bonding experience. And we both tend to be people who things do come quite easily for.
Mm-hmm.
So coding is the thing that we think we're going to try to learn to do. Not anything.
You should do it. It's
super...
totally not. I mean, honestly, I was completely self-trained. I don't know why the people I worked for, I have no idea what made them give me a job, because I never took a computer science class. I had no idea. I mean, I learned it myself. And honestly, I mean, the dirty little secret about programming, it's not that hard. Like, if you can think logically, which you can as a lawyer, you can do programming. Like, it's really just not that hard.
Well, then maybe that's not what we should do.
No, I think it would be a great thing to try, because it's a very interesting thing to know. It's a very interesting thing I find it very gratifying.
Yep.
It's a really, I think it's a great thing to learn. I mean, for me, I had been snowboarding for 15 years or something, and I decided to take up skiing because I wanted to do, like, I wanted to go back to being a beginner again and get uncomfortable and fall down just to practice doing that.
You're so good at this. Like, you're really, really good at...
I'm deliberate. Like,
well, no, and that's amazing, because I don't think people are deliberate in the way they lead their lives, and they stay comfortable and just kind of watch their life pass, like the partner, you know what I mean? They stay comfortable and they watch their life pass them by, and they find themselves stuck, or I'm doing air quotes, stuck in a life they didn't want to lead, with a lot of money and kind of success by someone else's terms. How do you get people, I guess, what do you say to someone who just says, because you seem really good at it. You not only seem really good at it,
I've had a lot of practice.
Really smart. Yeah.
I get bored easily. So that's why I like to make fundamental shifts and, learn new things.
I'm the exact same way. And before we got on, I told you that I started investing in real estate. So like a couple years ago, when I was on maternity leave with my first son, I was like, what am I supposed to do with all this free time? So I just became an expert in real estate and like joined a bunch of like local clubs and learned everything I could, and then bought my first fourplex.
Wow.
And then I know these are the things I do. And then with my second son, I had another little project. And then this last year, I started this podcast as my next project. So I definitely am somebody who likes to keep busy, but it comes with practice, like you said. So do you have any advice for someone on how to get started? Like, what's a way to kind of open up that side of yourself? Because I think everybody has it, just some people are not listening to it.
I think one thing, people have this idea like, oh, I have to make a very serious New Year's resolution. I one year was like, you know what? I don't really believe in this. I'm going to make a New Year's resolution to, have more fun, but in a very specific way. And I think that might've been when I took up skiing. I can't remember. But essentially we're talking about creativity almost. And, following, and again, this goes back to like getting in touch with yourself and what are you really interested in? So, everybody has that thing where they're like, oh, I would like to do this more or know more about this. Or, for me, like I took a pottery, like a wheel throwing pottery class at one point, just to kind of experiment. Like, oh, I used to like to do this in high school. Here's a class right up the street from me. Like, yeah, it's a little intimidating to think of like walking in there and not knowing what I'm doing. And, having all these weird strangers looking at me, like who goes to pottery classes in the Castro? Like, I don't know, but I feel like just do like the little step, commit to, I think a class or having like a trainer or a coach or something is really helpful because it can get you over that initial discomfort pretty quickly. And then if you're having fun, like you're going to want to keep doing whatever this is. And then that gives you kind of the practice of like, oh, I took that painting class and like, yeah, it was kind of scary, but in the end, like I have something to hang on my wall and I like it. And maybe that gives you the confidence in yourself to the next time be like, oh, maybe I can start looking for another job, or maybe I can, have a meeting with my boss to try to make this job a better fit for me. I think you can apply those skills into like a more serious context.
Wonderful advice. And so I have a couple of questions for you before we round out the episode.
Sure.
What resources do you have that have been really helpful for you on your journey that you'd like to share?
I mentioned Martha Beck earlier. I think she's super interesting. I remember reading her, like, I don't know if it now is her newest book, but the one about like chasing animals in the safari or whatever, and just being like, wow, this has gotten really woo-woo. But then like something from the book totally happened, like to me, and I was like, wow, this is so interesting. So I think Martha Beck is a great one. I think she just has such an interesting life story that like, how could you not kind of be inspired to think like, oh, I'm not stuck. Like, she was not stuck. I'm not stuck. I actually really like Pema Chandran, who is a Buddhist who writes a lot of books about like Tonglen practice, which I think is another way of sort of getting more. I think the favorite one is The Places That Scare You, which, as you can guess from the title, is basically about doing things that are scary. But it's very practical. It's not like, I don't know, I just feel like, yeah, I mean, it's just very like, it's about the breath and it's about all the stuff that we really overlook. And this stuff works. Like, you definitely will notice like, oh, I'm more in touch with like what's going on emotionally in the situation. And that's enabling me to react in a way that maybe isn't as reactive.
That's great. I will include both of those in the show notes. I've read Martha Beck. I have not read the other. And so I read 100 books a year. So I will add it to my list.
I don't know how I even found this book. I found it in law school and I would literally read it every night. And when I finished it, I would just start over. It's a very short book. And so I'd read a few pages a night and it was very calming. But I feel like it kind of sunk in on some level and like was helpful.
Yeah. And I think short and calming is what a lot of lawyers need.
Yeah. So I'm not somebody who can sit and meditate for like hours on end. I mean, I've done it, but I'm not going to do it like every day. Sorry. But I think having, a kind of toolbox of skills to go to when you're in a stressful situation can just be really valuable.
One of the things I've come to realize is that a lot of these tips, while they are obvious, it's having the knowledge of them as tools and the intentionality around using them that makes them useful.
Oh, for sure.
Because everybody knows that like you shouldn't be reactive when, you're in a stressful situation, but no one really thinks about how you deal with it.
And that's what I like about this book is it literally breaks down like exactly what to do. And so suddenly you're like, oh, okay. Like then you just have to remember to do it. And there's actually parts of the book that are kind of about, remembering to do things and that's part of the struggle. But yeah, I mean, like, they get it. Like people have been thinking about this stuff for a while.
Yeah, this is not new, but it's new to some people. So it's a great introduction for them.
No, it's very eye-opening when you realize like, oh my gosh, there actually are all these techniques I could be using. Huh. Okay. Like, why don't I learn about some of them?
Yep. So that transitions well into my last question. What do you think separates those people who find happiness in life from those who don't?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really hard question. I think some of it is a set point. I've done a lot of reading on the happiness question as well. I think I'm extrapolating, but I think about half of it is sort of like your temperament. Some people are just naturally sunny, but about half of it then is under your control. And I think it is about, setting up the conditions that you think are going to make you happy, evaluating how those are going, and really taking ownership. I mean, if somebody comes to me and they're like, I'm totally miserable in law school, like I hate everything about it. I'm like, well, have you thought about dropping out? And there's this moment of like, well, no, I can't do that. It's like, of course you can. And you probably should if you're really this unhappy. If you just want to wallow in this unhappiness, I'm not going to help you with that. Like
God, I love
you need to
advice.
like either choose to be there or choose to leave, but don't give me this crap about how like you can't leave. It's like, of course you can. So I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of it's just, as with most things, is about making choices and really owning the consequences of those. And it's not always easy. There's a lot of pressure, particularly at these top schools, to follow a certain path. And I mean, I remember even when I was applying for clerkships, my professor was like, you have to apply for appellate clerikships. I'm like, I don't want to do an appellate clerkship. I want to be in court. And they're like, but you have the grades. You're on law review. You have to do appellate. I'm like, I don't want to do that. And it's like, you have to really stand your ground and be clear about what you actually want to get out of an experience.
Absolutely. And so few people have sat down and have done that exercise. So it's so easy to succumb to that pressure. So hopefully your words will be helpful and guiding for people as they kind of move forward in their careers.
Well, hopefully. I mean, I'm not perfect, but we all do what we can.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Alison, for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was really my pleasure.
Thank you for joining me for the Happy Lawyer Project podcast. Please head over to my website, www.thehappylawyerproject.com, for more information from today's show. While you're there, I'd love it if you'd leave me your thoughts on the show. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, or follow me on Instagram. If you've enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. And don't forget to head over to iTunes to subscribe and review the show. As you know, each rating helps more listeners find the show and helps me get awesome guests on here for you guys. If there's anyone you'd like me to have on the show, or if you'd like to be on the show, head over to my website and let me know, or send me an email at Okoma, OKEOMA, @thehappylawyerproject.com. A special thanks to everyone who's left a review, sent me an email, or reached out to me in any way. I appreciate you. Thank you again for spending this time with me, and if you would like to learn more about working in your gift and living your passion, head over to the website for a free gift. Until next time, bye!